talking about this evening is our efforts so far on new regulations that we're proposing for open space. We're really early still in this process with this proposal. So what we have to share tonight is a broad framework. And as soon as we are through with this initial round of stakeholder engagement, we'll be working on draft text for the regulation changes. And then we will reach out again to make sure that we're getting input on those changes before we move any forward. So just want to stress that this is the beginning of the process. So the presentation tonight, I'll give you a little outline so you know what to expect. First, really quickly, we'll go over a little bit of terminology and background so that we're all on the same page with what this is, what we're talking about tonight. We'll talk quickly about the need that we see for open space in our communities and in Lexington. We'll go over our existing standards and regulations. We'll then talk about the draft proposal, so the changes that we want to propose. We'll talk quickly about some benefits. We'll go over the next steps for this particular set of changes. And then finally, we'll go into those breakout rooms for discussion. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page here, I think it's important to talk about how we as planners think about open space. So what do we mean when we say open space? So it's kind of a vague term when you first think about it, but open space is something that urban designers and that planners think about a lot. So open spaces are where we live our public lives, our community focused lives. So when we're not in our houses, our offices, our classrooms, our cars, we're outside, we're in open space. And in the city, buildings and streets tend to provide the boundaries for those open spaces. And so the way that open spaces, buildings, and streets relate to one another is really important. Those relationships really set the stage for how people feel when they're in those open spaces. Are they comfortable? Do they feel welcome? So open space is not just the leftover space between the buildings. It is actually part of the social infrastructure of our neighborhoods and our communities. So that might be at the scale of a large downtown plaza. It might be at the scale of a soccer field in a park, or it could be something as small as a vegetable patch in the middle of a shared courtyard garden at an apartment building. But without these types of open spaces, I think we would all agree that our cities, our neighborhoods just wouldn't feel complete. So just like we have regulations for the size and the height and the placement of buildings, we also need to make sure that we have regulations that ensure that during the development process, we get open spaces that serve neighborhoods. So with this set of regulation changes that we're discussing tonight, we're going to be focusing on the types of neighborhood open spaces, like the ones that are pictured here on the slide, that would be provided by developers as part of new development. So what are these regulation changes? The changes that we're going to be talking about are tied to our zoning ordinance. So as a result, you'll hear us refer to these updates as a zoning ordinance text amendment, and we call it a ZOTA for short. The zoning ordinance is like a rule book for the development and the land use changes that occur in our city. And if any of you are interested in learning more, taking a deeper dive on the zoning ordinance or other ongoing ZOTAs that we have, because we do have several in the works right now, we have a regulation changes page on our Imagine Lexington website that does a really good job of breaking down all these different changes and what they mean. And then why do we need to hear from you? So we need to hear various perspectives on open space, the way that it's designed, what is going to make you feel comfortable and welcome and connected to your community. That's really important for us to hear. We want to hear the neighborhood perspective on what will make future open spaces successful. So since we all live in neighborhoods and we all have experiences about what does or doesn't work for us in terms of open space in our neighborhoods, we want to hear from you. And finally, we believe that any policy that is modern and equitable should be informed by the public and shared with the public early and often. So that's why we're here with you tonight and why we'd like to hear from you. So with that, we'll just go ahead and jump right in. It's kind of nice. So even though we're in the early stage of this ZOTA, we have a lot of research that we've already completed as part of the public engagement for the 2018 comprehensive plan. So through the engagement, the public engagement for the comp plan, we had comments given by over 10,000 people across Lexington. They provided over 9,000 comments for us. And what's interesting is that over 1,700 of those comments were on green space. So that's more than any other named category that we had as part of our public outreach. So clearly we're a city that is passionate about open space and green space. And I just pulled out a couple of quotes from the comments that we received from the public. They're overwhelmingly positive, and people were asking generally for more and better open spaces and green spaces. So folks were saying things like green space accessible to people of all incomes residing in all neighborhoods, a place to connect and provide a common touch point for a neighborhood, incorporate parks, trails, and green spaces into any new development. So these are the types of things that we're hearing broadly from the community. And based off of that initial input that we got for the comp plan, that public interest, that public support directly is reflected in the goals and objectives of the comp plan. And these are goals and objectives that council unanimously approved. So if we dig into the comp plan a little bit, what we can see is that theme A is about neighborhoods. And within that theme, there are goals and objectives that kind of break down what we need to do, including an objective that says, incorporate adequate green space and open space into all development projects which serve the needs of the intended population. And then from that objective that's in the comp plan, we get an action item. So this is listed in the comp plan. It's an action item that is aimed internally at us in the government to do something about it. And what that action item says is to amend the zoning ordinance to redefine open space requirements. So I've got my copy of the zoning ordinance here. And there's a blank section. It's a reserved for future use section in the zoning ordinance right now, and it has been reserved for the open space ZOTA. So there's no disputing that this is a task that needs to be done, and the time to do it is now. So the sentiments that we have there from the comp plan are also echoed in our 2018 Parks and Recreation Master Plan. So for that plan, Parks and Recreation hired a consultant, and what the consultant found is that in Lexington, 63% of households are underserved by small neighborhood parks. 34% of the folks who responded to their survey said that too far from home was the reason for not using parks. And the national average responding to that question in that way is only 12%. And small neighborhood parks were the second most needed behind walking and hiking trails. So here's a map from the Parks and Rec Master Plan. Also, this was done by their consultant, and it's pretty revealing. So what this analysis shows is that only 40% of our population lives within a 10-minute walk to a neighborhood park. So I think it's important here to just clarify that we don't want to conflate public parks with the types of open spaces that we would be requiring in the zoning ordinance. So the zoning ordinance is going to be regulating development on private land. That said, we recognize that open spaces on private land can provide a lot of the same benefits to our community as public parks. And we need to leverage those spaces in order to meet our broader goals of getting everybody in Lexington equitable access to high quality open space. So furthermore, the consultant for the Parks Master Plan also produced this map, which shows where parks are specifically needed during development. So on this map, you can see that there are areas where we know that development is going to happen, and that's where we're going to need these resources. But again, publicly owned parks aren't the only way to meet the need. We also have common open spaces that could be owned and maintained by HOAs, apartment associations, neighborhood associations. We could be looking at open spaces that are owned and maintained by public-private partnerships, corporate sponsored open spaces, and nonprofit foundations like Town Branch Partnership. So we're coming into an age, or I guess you could say that we're really already in an age where cities can no longer rely solely on publicly owned open spaces to meet their needs. And our Parks Master Plan has acknowledged that Lexington is not different than other cities in that way. So from that information, Parks has a clear goal, and this is taken directly from the Parks Master Plan, and it says, increase the population served within a 10-minute walk of a neighborhood park or larger from the current 40% to 65% through development of existing parkland, new parks in growing areas, including developer contributions and improved access to existing parks. So this is a sort of incremental approach going from 40% to 65% of getting everybody in Lexington walking distance to a park. And that goal that Parks and Rec has is supported by national standards. So we look to the National Recreation and Park Association, the Trust for Public Land, and the Urban Land Institute. And they've come together to come up with a 10-minute walk campaign saying that everybody in the city should have a safe, easy access to a quality park within a 10-minute walk of their home by 2050. And another set of national industry standards, which is from LEED, LEED for Neighborhood Development. And what they're saying is that 90% of planned and existing dwelling units and non-residential use entrances should be within a quarter mile or a 5-minute walk of at least one civic and passive use space. And when you look at their definitions of civic and passive use space, what you see is that they're referring to open spaces. So that kind of brings us to where we are now. And this is where it's going to get a little bit technical for a few minutes, because we're going to talk through our existing zoning ordinance and what our current regulations are. So currently our zoning ordinance contains 169 mentions of open space. It is the regulations and the standards are scattered across multiple different articles. The definition of usable open space is quite ambiguous. We'll look at it in a second. And it can be quite difficult to measure when a plan is meeting the open space requirements. And also the standards that we do have don't apply in some types of development where they should. So all of this makes it really challenging for the designers and the engineers who are preparing site layouts, and also for the planning staff who are charged with verifying that these standards have been met. So it's an unnecessarily difficult process. And at the same time, the requirements really aren't giving us consistently good results for neighborhoods. So first, let's take a closer look at this organizational issue. Currently, the zoning ordinance regulates minimum usable open space by zone, and the standards that specify quantity are located in each separate zone. So the table that I'm showing you here, I know the text is really small, but it's a table that's not in the zoning ordinance. It's something that I made for myself so that I would have a little bit of help when I'm reviewing development plans. But what it does show, I think, is that we have a lot of standards. They're not always consistently written. They're scattered throughout the zoning ordinance, and often we have one section which tells you to go check out another section. So one thing that we plan to do through this SOTA is to consolidate this information and make it a lot easier to understand, and also put it into a type of language that anybody can understand. So anybody in our community could pick up the zoning ordinance and understand what the open space requirements are for their neighborhood. Next, let's take a look at the current definition of usable open space. This is the part of the presentation. I've given this several times before where I really wish I was in the room with folks, because I am going to read this to you and it's kind of painful to read. And I just wish I could see people's faces if they're rolling their eyes at me or if they're actually interested in this. But so our current definition of usable open space says outdoor area of a lot or tract which is designated and used for outdoor living, recreation, pedestrian access, or planting. That part seems clear enough, but then it goes on. Such areas may be ground or roof space 75% open to the sky, balconies a minimum of 5 feet wide, and enclosed deck, porch, or ground floor portions of a building constructed on columns. Off-street parking and loading areas, driveways, vehicular use area perimeter landscaping and interior landscaping, unenclosed fire escapes, or required front and side street side yards do not qualify as usable open space, provided, however, that those portions of the required side street side yard may qualify as usable open space as long as such open space is separated from the street right-of-way by a fence or solid screen planting. So that, I think, we could agree is a complex definition, and it's a definition that's been around since the 1965 version of our zoning ordinance. I think it's time for an update. But just to illustrate for you a little bit how that plays out on a plan. So this is a recent plan for apartments. It's an R5 zoned group residential project. It's about 5.5 acres, and there's about 385 dwelling units shown. So on a project like that, our current regulations would require 10% of the lot to be usable open space, but closer to 20% is what's shown on this plan. So the areas that are highlighted in red are the pedestrian areas, and those do count as usable open space under the current definition. The areas in yellow are vegetated areas, and most of those also count as usable open space, but the areas of vegetation that are considered vehicular use area perimeter landscaping do not count. The areas that are highlighted in green are paved areas such as a courtyard and a pool, and those also count under the current definition as usable open space. But where it gets interesting is that the current definition excludes side yards that don't have a fence. So this portion up here along the back is not counted. It also excludes front yards. So that area isn't counted, which in this case at least seems pretty counterintuitive because the front yard seems much more usable by people than this area along the back, which does count as usable open space under the current definition, but is the space behind a couple of dumpsters, a row of parked cars, and is mostly taken up by stormwater management. So we've got some fairly counterintuitive standards in the definition that miscategorize things relative to the goals of making sure that we're getting usable open space, usable by people. Mostly that comes down to the current definition, including planted areas in the first sentence. So the way this plays out is that the size, the dimension, the design, the location of those planted areas may be such that they're not usable to a person in any relevant sense. So we're conflating a couple of different categories here: vegetated open spaces in general, and then open spaces, whether they're vegetated or not, that could actually be used by people. So we definitely need both types of open spaces. We need vegetated spaces, but they're important for different reasons. And so we should have standards that make sure that we're getting both types. So finally, the standards that we do have, even though they're problematic, they don't apply in some areas where they should. So with the exception of development in the expansion areas, detached single-family homes like this neighborhood in Lexington are left out of the equation. So we know that residents in single-family developments do benefit from having private open spaces on their individual lots, so their backyards, but that doesn't diminish their need for community-focused space. So this kind of calls back to what we heard in that initial public comment, that is, regardless of your living arrangement, people have a need for community-focused, common open spaces within close proximity to their homes. So just to recap what those big issues are, first, the definition of usable open space is really complex. The regulations are kind of scattered about, and that makes our current regs inefficient and hard to use. Second, in the multifamily context, the current requirements don't ensure that our neighborhoods are consistently getting the types of open spaces that are intentionally planned for people. And third, we currently don't have any requirement for community-focused open spaces in our single-family detached context where people also clearly deserve access. So that gets us to our proposal. which is to take the current standards that we have for minimum usable open space and consolidate them into one article of the zoning ordinance under the title of combined open space. Now, combined open space would be the sum of two distinct types of open spaces, which can be defined and measured separately. So this is where we split out our vegetated areas from our common areas. And so simply put, vegetated areas are the portion of the project covered by existing or new vegetation. And common areas would be the portion of the project intentionally planned for outdoor gathering. So again, vegetated areas and common areas, both are needed. Both should have standards to make sure that we're getting the most benefit from each type. So we recognize that these two categories of open spaces aren't mutually exclusive. And that's why we've drawn them as this overlapping Venn diagram. So for example, if you had a common area with lots of hardscape, like a plaza, that wouldn't count as vegetated area also. But if you had a common area with a grassy field or a rain garden or lots of tree canopy, that would count towards the vegetated area and the common area requirement, so long as the vegetated portion is still planned to be directly useful by people. So we see that there could be some overlap here. And in fact, I think we'd like to encourage the overlap. Another example here, you could see in the back of this image that this could be considered a vegetated area and a common area, because clearly this is a space that people could use. But in the front, this is not really a space that people could inhabit or use really. And so that would be considered more of a vegetated area. And another example where green infrastructure is being used for managing stormwater, but it could also be intentionally planned for people to gather in and enjoy. So in our proposal, this type of landscape would satisfy both the vegetated area and the common area requirements using the same piece of land. So let's talk about what we are planning to regulate. And we'll start off by thinking about quantity. So right now in our multifamily zones, the minimums are based on a percentage of the lot size. That's generally between 10 and 20% of the lot is required to be usable open space. We would not be asking for more than what is already required in those zones. Most likely we'd be asking for slightly less combined open space in exchange for better quality common areas. In the single family context, we don't currently have any requirements for usable open space. So that would be a change. We would be asking for the inclusion of common areas as part of those developments. So further, we're also working on a draft list of standards for vegetated areas and common areas. So for vegetated areas, it would be pretty simple, limited restrictions, it just needs to be green. However, we are trying to come up with ways to incentivize more ecological landscapes like pocket forests or pollinator gardens, perhaps in exchange for less combined open space. We're also looking at ways to incentivize the preservation and restoration of environmentally sensitive areas. For the common areas, there would be some more standards that would ensure that we get the really high quality types of open spaces that neighborhoods need. So we're looking at standards that have to do with the access, the size and dimensions, the visibility, what the allowable adjacent uses would be, some minor physical improvements, plantings and trees, pedestrian scale lighting, maximum slope, and also for green infrastructure. We think it would be really beneficial to many if green infrastructure or stormwater management areas could be used as part of a common area. But we just want to make sure that we've got standards in place to ensure that that's serving as an amenity for the people who are using it. So here's an example that shows the layout and the placement of the types of common open spaces that these draft standards would be aimed at producing. We're thinking, this is open spaces that are highly visible from the street. They're visible from people's front doors. And it's easy to imagine this framework as for many different types of housing or at many different price points as well. It's also, I think, important for us to say what we're not planning to regulate. So the types of vegetation, although we might try to incentivize certain types of vegetation, we wouldn't be requiring anything. We wouldn't be requiring play equipment or outdoor structures, although we'd certainly like to incentivize that. The specific locations of open space, these standards are meant to be flexible. They're aimed at, can I access the open space from my neighborhood? And is it functional for me? So here we'll get a little technical again, but I think it's an important point to bring up. We mentioned that we have a lot of different ZOAs ongoing. We're looking at a lot of different regulation changes, and all of this is being spurred by the comprehensive plan. We're trying to get our regulations in alignment with what the goals and objectives of our comprehensive plan are. So a couple of other ZOAs that we're working on that are closely related to this one are floor area ratio and parking. So floor area ratio is some planner terminology for it's essentially the size of the building relative to the size of the lot. And it usually includes a maximum for the amount of ground floor area that the building can cover, the sort of lot coverage for the building. You can just think about it for the purposes of this as the amount of space that the first floor of a building takes up on a site. So if you imagine a plan view drawing of a site, kind of like a pie chart, there's really three things that take up space on the ground. It's the building, the parking and the vehicle use areas, and the open space. So we know that we can't isolate one of these elements without talking about the others, because just like on a pie chart, if one thing grows on the site, the others have to shrink in response. So the floor area ratio and lot coverage ZOA that was passed by council back in September of last year made some really modest adjustments to increase the amount of building allowed in our multifamily zones. And we're currently working through a big overhaul to our parking standards to modernize those and to make our requirements for parking lots greener, adding more tree canopy coverage as well. And we're also working on open space. So I just want to point out that we're tackling these changes with a really coordinated approach. Many of the staff that are working on this ZOA are also working on these others. And so the general idea here is that taken together, these three ZOAs allow more room for building, hopefully will create some savings from less required parking so that more resources can be redirected into these higher quality open spaces. So in tandem, when we look at all these things together, the changes that we're pursuing to support the comp plan goals for neighborhoods have to do with density, design, and equity. And those are the sort of three pillars of neighborhoods that we talk about in the comp plan. And there's a relationship between these things that I'd like to point out quickly. We know that we've got to provide more density, but we know that we need to build that density in a way that is balanced and intentional. We need density, yes, we need it to be livable density. So that's where design comes in. These types of open spaces that we're talking about balance the aesthetic and the environmental and the social impacts that come along with that increased density. And making sure that everybody has access to these open spaces is critical, and it's even more critical as we continue to grow. So I'll kind of breeze through these benefits pretty quickly because I think that everybody knows that there are numerous benefits to public health and community well-being provided by open spaces. We can talk about these more, but I think that they're pretty well-known benefits. Same goes for environmental quality and stewardship. These are pretty well-known benefits. So we'll just keep going. But there are some other benefits, economic benefits that do, I think, get overlooked when we're talking about overspace, benefits to attracting business. So we know that that folks look for the kind of city that they want to live in, and then they're looking for work. This is a trend that we're seeing, and employers know this too. And so in a survey that we reference in the comp plan, it's asking the decision makers where they're going to locate their new facilities. And quality of life comes in fourth place, beats out a lot of other things. And there's really no debating that access to high quality open space, and that neighborhoods that have that kind of access really contribute to the quality of life that a city can provide. And so it's quite important from an economic standpoint as well. And then also, we've talked about a lot of these benefits from the community standpoint, but it's also important that we recognize that the developer has to benefit from this too. So our focus throughout the implementation of our comp plan has been to unlock higher utilization of the land. We know that our land is very expensive, and we're dealing with two primary constraints. So we need to address the needs and the wants of the community, but we also need to ensure that developers have the tools that they need to meet the needs of the community and also to make a profit. So we're trying to pursue all of these ZOAs with those two issues front of mind. And so what that means specifically for the open space ZOA is that in general, we're trying to provide more space for development in exchange for more purposeful, more intentional, and better open space. In the multifamily context, that's going to mean asking for a little bit less combined open space in exchange for better quality. In the single family, that's probably going to mean intentionally designed non-developable areas to serve as community-focused open space. We're getting very close to the end of the presentation here. So I just wanted to let you all know that we have presented this several times already to different groups. We first previewed this information with the Planning Commission back in September of last year. And since then, we've been giving pretty much the same presentation to several different groups. We've been in front of the Infill and Redevelopment Steering Committee. We've talked to the design and the development community. We've been in front of the Stormwater Stakeholder Advisory Committee. Just earlier this week, we met with the Building Industry Association, and now we're here with you all tonight. And the next steps that we have for the rest of this winter, we'll be continuing to engage stakeholder groups with our round one, so very similar to the presentation that you're getting tonight. And then moving us into spring, we hope to be working on draft text, doing internal collaboration with other departments in the government. And by spring, our goal is to be back in front of the Planning Commission with some draft text. And then once we've shared that with the Planning Commission, we would then be able to engage stakeholder groups for round two and share that draft text for review. And finally, a slide that shows who we've been working with. So internally, this is a regulation change that impacts a lot of different divisions and departments. So we're working carefully with Parks and Rec, with the transportation planning and bike and pedestrian planning, with environmental services, with water quality, engineering, public safety, senior services, and lots of boards and commissions too. So we'll be presenting this information to the Green Space Commission next month. We hope to get in front of the Environmental Commission and the Parks and Rec Advisory Board as well. And then in terms of stakeholder groups, we've got pretty much everybody we've already talked to so far is on this list. But if you know of other folks that we should be reaching out to that you think would have an interest in this, please bring that up in the breakout room or send me an email and let me know so that we can make sure that we're reaching as many people with an interest as we can. So thank you all very much again, and we'll see you next time.